Welcome to Mr. Deer's helpful history look at the early Cold War. To remember the events of the early Cold War, you just simply need to remember one word: mistrust. Each letter of mistrust will give us another word, which will give us the events of the early Cold War in the correct chronological order. First letter of mistrust is M. They meet as mates. They meet at the conferences Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Check out my other video to help you remember the details of those conferences, but Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam spells tip. The conferences are a tipping point in relations because they start out as mates or allies fighting against the Nazis and the Japanese in World War II. By the final conference at Potsdam, World War II is coming to a close, and because of mistrust, the great powers, or the big three, are beginning to fall out and the Cold War is getting going. The next letter of mistrust is I, ideology. The two sides had different ideologies which led them to argue. The USA is a capitalist country, the USSR is a communist country. Capitalists believe in maximising freedom. People should be free to make money and get rich, while other people will be free to work less hard and remain poor. Communists, on the other hand, believe in maximising equality. Everybody should work hard together and share the profits out equally. Why don't these two ideologies get on? Let's make it quite simple. In 1917, Russia had a revolution and became the world's first communist country. Straight away, they set up Cominform, an organisation to spread the revolution around the world, overthrow capitalist countries, and abolish all countries so they could spread wealth equally around the world. Obviously, capitalists didn't like this, and as soon as World War I finished, the big powers joined together to invade Russia in the Russian Civil War to crush the communists. Why did they do this? Well, capitalists believe in free global markets. Anybody from any country should be free to trade and start businesses around the world. Communists believe in controlling the economy and controlling free markets to try and maximise equality. So because of these two different ideologies, these two different political ideas, capitalism and communism, America and Britain on the one hand and the USSR on the other hand did not trust each other. There was mistrust because of ideology, and it led to tension in the early Cold War. Our next letter is S, Stalin's satellite states. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was paranoid about another German or capitalist invasion of the USSR through Eastern Europe. And in World War II, his Russian Red Army had advanced through Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland and East Germany on its way to crushing Hitler in Berlin. So they were already in control of Eastern Europe and decided to set up similar communist-style satellite states in the Eastern European countries, which Stalin would be able to control as a buffer zone, a safety zone between him and the Western world. Our next letter of mistrust is T, the Truman Doctrine. President Harry S. Truman gave a speech in the United States promising to help any free country resist if it was fighting communism. Truman's doctrine followed Winston Churchill's speech where he said an iron curtain had descended on Europe, that thick red line on the map there. Truman's doctrine said capitalist countries needed to contain communism, stop it spreading any further west. Churchill and Truman were particularly concerned about Greece, where a civil war was raging between communists and capitalists. Greece was important because if it went communist, it would allow Stalin access to the Mediterranean and potentially the Suez Canal. T, the Truman Doctrine. President Truman promises to help capitalist countries and to contain communism. Our next letter of mistrust is R, rebuild. To back up the Marshall Plan, the US transferred around $12 billion in aid to European countries to help them rebuild. They did this to try and stop desperate people voting communist, and it pretty much worked. Joseph Stalin saw this as dollar imperialism. He said America was tying the countries of Europe to the West, and in response he refused to let the Eastern European satellite states accept Marshall aid. As a result, the USSR formed its own economic group called Comecon, and the idea of Comecon was to share resources between the communist countries. In the early years of the Cold War, Comecon helped to rebuild quite a lot of housing in Eastern Europe, and it wasn't so obvious that the West was doing much better. However, in the long term, Comecon worked mainly to take resources out of the Eastern European countries and send it to the USSR. Although, as an aside, the USSR did transfer around $25 million worth of aid to communist China, but that comes later. Our next letter of mistrust is U, unite. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies had decided to temporarily divide Germany and Berlin into 4 military occupation zones. They did this to try and keep control of the country while they decided its future. Stalin was convinced Germany should be kept poor and weak in revenge for the damage the Nazis had caused to the USSR in World War II. As a result, the Allies agreed that Stalin could take reparations from all zones of Germany in compensation for the damage that had been caused. However, in 1947, they began to talk about giving martial aid to the Western Zone. America and Britain joined up their two zones to make Bizonia. And then 1 year later, in 1948, the French joined their zone to the other two Western zones, creating Trizonia. In 1948, they then created a new currency for Western Germany, the Deutschmark. This started to make Stalin think that the USA was creating a new and strong, powerful capitalist country in the West. And as a result, this leads us on to our next letter. S. Stalin's blockade and the American airlift. Stalin was furious that American generals had stopped paying him reparations from Western Germany, as they'd agreed to do at the Potsdam Conference. He also didn't like the arrangement of having the Western military allies in West Berlin, a city divided between the Soviet zone and the Western capitalist zone. So within Eastern Germany, you had this little island of capitalism with the French, British and American military zones of Berlin. Stalin decided to get the American, British and French militaries to leave by cutting all rail and road connections between West Berlin and Western Germany. He hoped this would starve out the Western allies because they wouldn't be able to get oil, coal, food and all the other military necessities to stay. In response, Truman could have gone to war, but that would have risked World War III, so he opted for a more peaceful response. They decided to airlift in, to fly in by plane supplies to Western Berlin. This was a huge propaganda victory for Truman, as he and the American and British militaries looked like the good guys flying in supplies to starving West Berliners. And on the other hand, Stalin looked like the bad guy. It was a propaganda defeat for Stalin, as he looked like the aggressor. Stalin could have shot down those planes, but again, he did not want to risk World War III. So the Berlin blockade, Stalin's Berlin blockade and the American airlift also revealed to us that neither side was really willing to risk war in 1948 and 1949. Our final letter of mistrust is T, treaties. Both sides team up with lots of other countries, making alliances which say that if any one small country is attacked, all of the others will go to war. This makes a global nuclear world war much more likely by 1955. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is set up under America in 1949 after the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade. It's America, Canada and a lot of the Western countries of Europe. You'll see from the map Turkey is also a member. They join a little bit later, and that really worried the Soviet Union as it's below them. However, in 1955, in response to NATO, the USSR sets up the Warsaw Pact. All the countries of Eastern Europe, the satellite states and the Soviet Union agree that if any one of them is attacked, they will all respond. Also, to end off the early Cold War, in 1953, Joseph Stalin had died. So the Warsaw Pact is actually created by his successor, Nikita Khrushchev. But we'll come on to what happens next later on. For the early Cold War, we start in 1943, meeting as mates, and we end with T, two teams willing to go to nuclear war. So mistrust has caused this rise in tension in the early Cold War. And the next period of the Cold War is a huge period of tension, and you can check out my next video to find out more about that. I hope you've enjoyed finding out about the early Cold War. These mnemonics, these simple words will help you to remember it. So mistrust, mistrust. Remember the early Cold War. Have a great day.